On today's show, I'm joined by my friend Milo, a Chaldean Catholic, to discuss the history of the Chaldean Church. Uh, I personally don't know too much about the Chaldean Church and its history from the Apostolic times, so I'm hoping to learn throughout this video. But in this video, we hope to do something similar to the discussion we had on the Maronite Church, but maybe in a more conversational way to explore the Chaldean tradition, the East Syriac tradition, and to discuss where the various groups of the Assyrian Church have come from. So I'll just pass this over now to my friend Milo.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Just to let everyone know that I'm no scholar in the Chaldean Catholicism, and so as I was preparing for this, I even learned many things. So I'm looking forward for the conversation ahead. Now, in order to understand what Assyrian Chaldean Catholicism is, we must know what the Church of the East is. For this is where we come from as a tradition, as a church. Usually, in these type of historical explanations, we always start with the namesake, but I think that doesn't render our church justice in its rich history. So we know that during the times of Jesus Christ, Persia was the other superpower empire alongside with Rome. And within Persia, not only you had Parthians, but as well you had ancient Assyrian and Babylonian people who spoke Aramaic, alongside exiled Jewish people. And this is very important as in the formation of the liturgical and spiritual aspects of the church. Now we can see the initial spread of Christianity denoted in Acts 2. So in Acts chapter 2, verses 5 to 11, it states, "Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound, the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. And they amazed and wondered, saying, Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us in his own native language, Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God." But the Acts of the Apostles, however, focus primarily on the disciples' spread of the gospel within the Roman Empire. Thus, we can only understand or decrypt the roots of the Church of the East through his holy tradition and historical documents. And so the most notable of these writings include the Doctrine of Addai, the Acts of Thaddeus, and the History of the Church by Eusebius. So it's written, that during Jesus' ministry, the king of Edessa, Abgar, his name was, he heard and marveled over the miracles and teachings of Jesus. He sends his courier Ananias requesting healing because he was dealing with an illness eventually. And in his writing, he comes with two conclusions. He says, "You're either the Son of God or God Himself," which is kind of funny the way he writes. And Jesus, it's supposed that Jesus wrote back the message, but I think more of the appropriate, just out of piety, that Jesus sends a message. He passes it along Ananias, and he says, "Blessed are you that have believed in me without having seen me. For it is written concerning me that they who have seen me will not believe in me, and they who have not seen me will believe and be saved. But in regard to what you have written to me, that I should come to you, it is necessary for me to fulfill all things for which I have been sent. And after I have been fulfilled them, after I have fulfilled them, thus to be taken up again to him that sent me. But after that I have been taken up, I will send you one of my disciples, that he may heal your disease and give life to you and yours." And so this promise is fulfilled after the ascension. And so by Pentecost, St. Thomas, under divine impulse, he sends out Addai to Edessa to meet the king. Now, who Addai is, there's various opinions. Eusebius records him to be part of the 72 disciples that Luke writes. But in the Acts of Thaddeus, which is a later rendition of the Doctrine of Addai, like a retelling of it, he explicitly mentions that Addai or Thaddeus, which retells the story of Abgar, was from the 12th, so Jew Thaddeus. For me personally, I believe it's Jew Thaddeus. But even prior telling to the story, Eusebius kind of explains the intersectionality between the 12 apostles and the 70 group of disciples. So they could have been part of both in a sense. But I
I don't want to
digress.
have I don't want to jump in and ruin your flow because I'm really enjoying this so far. But
Yeah.
I didn't know that. See, I read a little booklet earlier this year on devotion to Saint Jude Thaddeus, and I heard of
Mm,
that whole story. I never knew because I always knew Adai and Mari were the founders of the Persian churches, the
mm.
Syrian churches. I didn't know that they're commonly identified with Thaddeus. I don't know if you're going to go into it, but I'd be interested to know um, kind of who historically had the different opinions, if you have that information.
Well, from what I understand, Eusebius makes it clear that Addai was from the 70, and this is supposedly coming from Syriac sources. But the doctrine, sorry, not the doctrine, the Acts of Thaddeus, which came a bit later, it explicitly mentions the 12 as he's a part of the 12, as I
Yeah,
mentioned. And so, from what I've seen from Assyrian Church of the East and Chaldean resources, it interchanges. There's no, let's say, consensus where like we are confident in saying that Addai is one of the 12 of the 70. Um, that's pretty much all we have. It's all speculation at this point.
well,
I'm not too sure about like particular schools of thought or
yeah.
particular scholars, but
Well, I
that's
don't think
about it.
there's a contradiction in itself,
No, no.
in the sense that, like, I always thought that the 12 were counted among the 70. Just like
Yeah,
how Christ had an inner circle in the 12, it's like the
mm,
inner three that are also part of the 12, which are part of the 70. But
yeah, and I think Eusebius implicitly says that, and Matthias and Thaddeus he identifies to be within that kind of 70 group.
yeah,
Mm.
nice. All right. Well, yeah, keep on going.
Yeah, so the story it differs from the Acts of Thaddeus and the doctrine of Addai. Um, what is said is that when Ananias went to Jesus, uh, Abgar actually he actually told him, "Can you record how this man looks like?" But Ananias was incapable of explaining,
Hmm.
and so apparently our Lord he washes his face, or he puts a cloth over his face, and the image of his face is imprinted. So kind of like a shroud, and he it's passed on to Abgar, and Abgar is healed from that before even Thaddeus comes. Yet in Eusebius and in the doctrine of Addai, we see that it's until Thaddeus uh, visits Abgar, he heals Abgar, and his house and many of the citizens within Edessa are baptized. And so the gospel is not preached; it's preached not only to the Jewish inhabitants of the city, but there was also the message sent to the descendants of the Assyro-Babylonians. So those under Persia, those under Edessa, who came from the roots of the Assyrian and Babylonian Empire. And so many people would say that this occurrence of King Abgar and his establishment, or rather his conversion to Christianity, was the birthplace of the Syriac tradition in Christianity. And even Abgar and Thaddeus are recorded to destroy pagan idols and temples and set up churches. But the other major missionary activity that took place was in the royal twin cities of Seleucia Ctesiphon. And this is where, in the Acts of Mari, Addai, it actually details the story of Abgar again, but Addai sends his disciple Mari, who again, Mari is recorded to be part of the 70, to preach the inhabitants of the royal cities in Mesopotamia. He converts Nisibis, and he apparently sets up a monastery there, and he moves on to various regions in the city of Mesopotamia. Pious tradition suggests that he sets up over 300 covenants, which is kind of insane. Mari ultimately convinces the kings of both Seleucia and Ctesiphon of the validity of Christianity, in which Marmari heals the Ctesiphon's king's daughter, if I'm not mistaken, or one of his relatives, something along those lines, in which the thriving cities of Edessa, the Sebes, and Idiabin, or northern Iraq, interconnected by the Silk Road, it provided a fertile ground for the spread of Christianity. And again, to reiterate, not only we had dispersed Jewish communities since the Babylonian exile, we also had descendants of the Assyrian and Babylonian people who adopted the Aramaic language. And so when it comes with ecclesial, like the ecclesial structure of the church, um, we see that the Church of the East actually and initially was dependent on the Patriarchate of Antioch. So the bishops of the Church of the East were subject to Antioch. But in the Synod of 410, the Persian bishops had a synod, and under the presidency of Mar Isaac. And it was this council that the creed and canons of Nicaea and Constantinople were received by the church. It's not that they never believed it earlier, actually, they were incapable of actually participating in the ecumenical councils occurring in Rome, because obviously big tensions between Rome and Persia.
Yeah.
But this was also the first time where we see the beginnings of the Church of the East independence from the West. So Isaac, Omar Isaac, he's considered to be the head of all Eastern Christians within Persia, right? So it kind of, there's kind of a claim that he's no longer under the subject of Antioch, that these are his own people and he's the one to overlook them.
And this is the the ca- the council in 410. Is this also
Yes.
the council that we discussed, which seems to have the Filioque interpolated into their creed?
Yeah, so there's two renditions. There's an Eastern and Western rendition of that. And I think it's in the Western one where
Yeah.
it says that the Spirit comes from the Father and the Son. It doesn't specify procession, but it's implicit that it's from the Father and the Son.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, interesting. All right, that's really interesting because I'm actually learning a lot myself, having just
Mm,
studied the churches in Antioch and not realizing how close the border between these two empires was. You know, listening
mm,
about Saint Ephrem being a Syriac father, and I was just reading myself how he began in Nisibis, and there was his. I was under the famous Bishop Jacob of Nisibis, and
mm,
how because of conflict between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, Nisibis was given over to the Persians, and the Christians were expelled, and that's why Ephrem was moved over into Edessa, which remained in the Roman Empire. So,
yeah.
uh, yeah, that's all. I did not realize how prominent the Persian Empire was during during this time. But you're
Yeah.
speaking of multiple kings as well. Is this
Mm,
how is the Persian Empire, if you know, structured at this time where there seems to be multiple kings? You mentioned with the I can't recall. You just mentioned him, the king that Jude
King
Thaddeus
Abgar?
went to. Yeah, he was king
Yeah.
of where exactly? You said
So,
Edessa.
yeah. So there was, I think at this time, we had Persia, there was Rome, but there was a little ancient region in Upper Mesopotamia called Ossorene. I'm not exactly know how to pronounce that, but
Yeah.
it's essentially where Edessa is. So it was kind of like not necessarily under the Parthians, from what I understand. Just looking at the way the map is structured, it looked like it was its own kingdom in itself. But in regards to the geography of Persia, that I'm not well informed. So it seemed that, from what I understand, there were many, let's say, monarchs of regions,
Yeah.
kind of similar, maybe how Rome there was like governors across different uh, places around Rome.
Well,
I
Herod
think
was
it's
called the king, right? And
yeah,
so
exactly.
you have in the Syrian province of Rome a king Herod. So it doesn't surprise me necessarily that in a broader Persian Empire, or even if Edessa at this time was still in the Roman Empire geographically, that there would be another king called Akbar. So that's
Yeah,
really interesting. Hello. Looks like we had a bit of a dropout here. All right, no. All right, you're back. You're back.
yeah,
There
I
we
don't know
go.
why.
That's all right. Yeah, no, okay. I was just about to go on a little point thinking you'd might have dropped out for a bit longer, but there does seem to be a bit of a, what the maps I'm looking at now indicate like a buffer zone almost. Like
Hmm,
regions along these East Syriac cities that are kind of halfway between a border conflict
hmm.
regions. Um, yeah, okay. I'm still learning a lot. This has been really interesting. So keep on going because this is fascinating. I feel like this is next door to my own tradition. So and it borders like it borders so closely with it that there's so much overlap that I didn't know that Edessa was converted by the Apostle Jude.
Yeah, and the funny thing is as well in my notes as you explain Ephraim, that's where that's where I wrote as well for like the next part of my, let's say, discussion, that during the first century the people in Mesopotamia and Persia who were able to travel without any issues, they went to Nisibis, and they even went to Edessa to gather for Christian education. And so we know the school of Nisibis was founded by Mariakob or Jacob Nisibis,
Yeah.
which was modeled after the school of Diodorus of Tarsus and Antioch. And when
Mm.
Nisibis fled to Persia, that's where Ephraim went to Edessa. And so we already see here that the East and West Syriac traditions, there there's a lot of intermingling with them. So that's why if you go to a Maronite liturgy, you go to an Assyrian Chaldean liturgy, you will realize, wow, there's a lot of things here very similar besides the language in itself,
Yeah.
the theology and the approach. In fact, later on you'll see when I explain kind of the East Syriac mindset, it's essentially the Syriac mindset. There's no something, it's not overly unique where it's like a completely different one, a completely different spirituality to that of the West. So we play a part in the formation of each other's churches. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So moving on, and 424, before the Council of Ephesus, mind you, there was a synod of at this time, the his name was Marodadisho, and Dadisho he held the synod and he declared himself independent of all the other churches from the West. Now, why he did that is more of a political thing in the sense that I think he went through persecution under the Persians, and he formally declares independence from the Western Church.
Mm.
So thus he rejects that any interference come from Antioch or Byzantium. About Byzantium, yeah. None of those churches should have any influence, and even he emphasizes Petrine language. So he even appeals kind of to Peter
Mm.
that, as you know, kind of the way I kind of understand it, just briefly looking at it, is that each patriarch per se is like their
Mm.
own Peter. And so, as a result, this is the first time where the title Catholicos Patriarch is used in the Church of the East.
Okay.
However, what they did afterwards is that from Mar Isaac, they retitled him because he was a metropolitan, I would say at that time. They renamed him as Catholicos to render him that it's only just that he is a patriarch from
Mm.
this on. But it was this point before Ephesus where the patriarch uh, was like he independent from the West.
Okay. Well,
And I think this is more of like a, sorry to cut you off. It's more of a safety for the people because, as you know, Persia, Rome, not friends at this point,
yeah.
at any point really. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll just expand a little bit on that Petrine language because that can be a bit surprising or confusing to
Mm,
some Catholics, but it's actually perfectly traditional in our ecclesiology. It stems all the way to Saint Cyprian, but basically,
mm,
when you look at early ecclesiological documents, for you not to kind of end up in one of the two extreme camps, which would be to either assert that the Petrine language attributed to all bishops is contrary to Vatican I, which is
mm,
erroneous, or the opposite extreme, which is somehow to say that Petrine language is you're basically conceding the same premise that for Vatican I to be true, Petrine language must exclusively be limited to the Bishop of Rome.
mm,
Well, that's not necessarily the case. We can truly speak of every bishop, and this goes back to Saint Ignatius of Antioch's own writings. Every bishop being a true Peter in his church,
yeah.
and then we speak of degrees of Petrine office. So like you'll have the Petrine nature of every bishop, and that's taught even by the bishops in Rome. But
Mm,
then you have the unique Petrine characters of the three Petrine sees, being Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria, and those can be spoken of as Petrine in a more unique way than other bishops. And then finally, you have the fullness of the Petrine office in its papal prerogatives
mm,
existing in Rome. But I did have one question for you.
yeah.
Because like we see at Nicaea at Canon 6, which kind of establishes the patriarchates in Alexandria and Antioch
Mm.
and grants them authority, and then Constantinople seeks to do something similar to itself. Um, is there any engagement or acceptance of these councils by Rome or any other patriarchs? Like, at what point does Rome look at these councils and say, okay, fair enough, this Far East church, this East Syriac church, we will grant it its patriarchate?
Well, the thing is, I don't. So when the patriarchate was established in 424, when Mardadisho set up the synod, it wasn't necessarily recognized. I think at this point, very rarely did the West interact with the Church of the East. It was quite difficult um, for political reasons.
Mm,
So this is their synod. They promulgated it, and this is what they said. And this is from the experience of the bad experiences that Mardad Isho dealt with from the Persians,
yeah.
and that was it. After I'm not entirely sure if Rome or any other of the patriarchs mentions this. This is, and I think this is like a peculiar attribute of our church, is that there's a sense of independency just because of our geographical location. That the we weren't there weren't I don't think there were any Persian bishops attending Nicaea. That's the thing, and that's why it took until 410 for it to be formally codified in our synod. That was like the first time we were able to come together
Mm,
without any fear. So from what I see, it's not necessarily like mainly a disagreement of theology, and that's one aspect that could be definitely,
yeah.
but like eventually. But I think it as well comes down with the political situation that because it was unfair for the Persian bishops to deal with the West in this, and they can't interact with the West as Antioch as Alexandria. It just wasn't possible.
Yeah, yeah.
So
No,
I
no,
think just
that's
for
that
their
makes
sake,
yeah,
for the
that
sake and
makes
for the
sense.
sake of the people, it's just let's just keep it within our borders. Within Persia, we're our own
Yeah.
patriarchate.
So then you said that. So then, is there a distinction? I'm just trying to understand this between.
Mm.
So you said that none of the Persian bishops went to Nicaea, but Jacob did. So is there like a, is it kind of like a gradient between like Antioch and then those countries, then those cities like Edessa where Ephraim and Jacob were, and then further out east, or is there like a hard line anywhere? Because I mean, if Jacob of Nisibis went to Nicaea, is he
Mm.
not technically like you wouldn't say he's Persian then, under
I
the way you're reckoning it?
I can argue. Yeah, I mean, you can say like at least one bishop from our church, from our tradition, attended Nicaea.
Yeah.
I think maybe the more appropriate or more accurate is to say
Oh,
that
okay,
we
so you
weren't
would say
entirely.
Jacob is of your tradition. I was just trying to work out whether or not
Yeah,
you viewed
I mean,
like
we like.
Ephraim and Jacob as immediately part of your churches, or
I
like
mean, we
a
definitely
bit.
do. We
Okay,
like just recently we just venerate celebrated Jacob's feast day, so he's definitely a
yeah,
huge uh, uh like a huge component in our tradition. But from what I understand, just from reading sources, it's like, oh, we didn't really have many bishops attending, or there were no bishops. Jacob, yeah, he attended Nicaea, um, but I've seen ones like, oh, at least one bishop, which I'm assuming it would have been referring to Jacob. So it's just quite difficult to for the Persian, well, the church in Persia to interact with the councils at that time. That's why it took until 410.
yeah. Okay,
But yeah.
all right. Oh, nice. All right, keep on going.
All right, so where were we? So we know what happens in Ephesus. I don't think we have to explain. We
I think
well, our
maybe it
church
might
didn't
be
bother with it.
good.
Well, the church thought that Nestorius's Christology was perfectly orthodox. Um, that in itself is like a 1 hour show on its own. But what ends up happening, we refuse to condemn Nestorius, and as a result, we are formally condemned by the West.
Okay. I
And
might
so,
jump in
yeah,
then, just
yeah, go for
because
it.
sometimes speaking about certain early councils can feel
Mm,
natural depending on your tradition. Like you being of the Chaldean tradition, you're going to be familiar with Ephesus, but generally speaking, most people are pretty unfamiliar with the details of these things. So I'll just give a quick,
Yeah, go
brief
for it.
overview of why Nestorius is kind of relevant. So Nestorius was a monk priest in Antioch, and so he's of the Antiochian school of theology. And so at Ephesus, when he's denying, he was elected, even though he was from Antioch, he was elected um, Archbishop of Constantinople, which isn't uncommon because one of his you also had like John Chrysostom in a similar situation, being from Antioch and then Bishop of Constantinople, and he denied the title that Our Lady was the Mother of God. So he thought it's only appropriate to speak of her as the Mother of Christ. Um, and so that ended up causing major problems between him and Cyril of Alexandria. And so Nestorius was removed by the Third Ecumenical Council at Ephesus to keep things short. And then what happens to him? Like he's sent into exile, but where does he go? What does he do? Does he go as far east as um, into your churches?
I believe that he's exiled to Mount Sinai, is he not?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I,
Yeah.
I was
Well,
focused more on the
I'm not well
theology of
formed on. Actually, that's one indicator of the Chaldean Church. The Greek doctors, as the Assyrians would identify, which is Diodora, Theodore of Mopsistia, and of Nestorius. They
yeah.
they don't really, if at all, have any kind of role in our church, rather other than using the anaphoras, which we can discuss later. So
Interesting.
Chaldean, if you talk to a Chaldean, like, oh, what do you think of Nestorius? Majority of the time, they'd be like, who? They just don't know.
But is
But
he
from
venerated in the Assyrian Church of the East?
I know the Assyrian Church of the East.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course he is. They call him
So,
Mother Nestorius. Yeah.
so traditionally, like in the history, Nestorius and Theodore of Mopsuestia are received as Orthodox theologians.
Yeah. They even I've heard
What?
from some Church of the East members and I think some clergymen that they would call Nestorius an unbloodied martyr because he was unfairly uh, condemned by Ephesus, by the West.
Yeah. So then,
So to that point, yeah.
out of my own curiosity, and
Mm.
uh, so because Theodore of Mopsuestia is what was his relation? He was also the Antiochian school, but he was
He was not the teacher of
Nestor.
Nestorius, was he not?
He
Yeah.
was okay. Yeah, that's what I was. I remember he was either the disciple or the teacher. Um,
Mm.
so he's kind of known famously as being a Nestorian. But
Mm.
what about in your tradition? And when I speak of your tradition, I know that as a Chaldean Catholic, you want to speak of like an authentic Catholic tradition. So you're
Yeah.
not going to be quick to jump and institute these people. But I'm speaking like from a historical perspective.
Mm.
The Assyrian churches, did they also have a strong reception of Theodoret of Cyrus or Ibas of Edessa? Because I know that Theodore of Mopsuestia, Theodoret, and Ibas were all condemned the Fifth Ecumenical Council as a move by the Chalcedonian Greeks to
Mm.
show that they aren't Nestorian to the monophysites, because the
Mm.
monophysites believed Chalcedon was Nestorian. And so they're like, no, look, we're going to condemn all these Nestorians to prove to you that Chalcedonian Christology is not Nestorian. And then that
Mm.
causes a massive problem with the Pope, who doesn't like this method, but it ends up happening anyway. So is there like is there any interaction with Theodoret of Cyrus or any value of him or Ibas in terms of your history or
Well, I know
theology?
for Theodore of Cyrus, I think he's well received in the Church of the East. There's not really. I'm not. I would admit that I am not well formed in this particular
Yeah.
uh, part of history and theology. But I know from just members that I've talked to that they seem to be very happy with Theodoret of Cyrus, and they tend to quote him, and you know,
Hmm.
but that's all I know of mine.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, all right,
Yeah.
sounds good. So,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. Now we can just go into the Chaldean. So we're at this stage where we're established, we're in Persia. And I think by the 13th century, this is where we consider the church to be at its peak. The Church of the East expansion extended from all the way from Cyprus and even to that of China. Um, for anyone who's interested, you go online. Some guy, he he did the liturgy or the liturgy of Adda and Mari in the Chinese language, that and the tone that would have been around that time when the Nestorian missionaries went to China, which is pretty cool. It's a good watch. But
Wow.
unfortunately, yeah, it's pretty cool. But by the 14th century, this is where a huge devastation happens to the Assyrian people, and that is Timur Lane. And we were being killed for, like, we were slaughtered, our people. And a vast majority of us were eradicated, and we became centralized in our humble beginnings back in Mesopotamia. And because of this persecution, the successor of the patriarch of the Church of the East became hereditary, since the
Wow.
occurrence of synods was impractical and unsafe. And this is the impetus of the first Chaldeans. What ends up happening is that the uncle designates the successor to be his nephew, but he wasn't allowed to consecrate his nephew. He's just able to name his successor. The bishop consecrate another bishop consecrates him, and this goes on for many years. But by the 1500s, it's a bit settled, so it's not as necessary as it was. But yet they still continue this supposed tradition. But by 1552, this is where the Chaldeans come into fruition. When Patriarch Shimon Ishoyab, he designates his nephew at a very young age. So his nephew was probably 12 or 15 at the time, but he passes away. And he designates his other nephew, who was his brother. His name is Elia. So keep Elia in your mind, it's very important.
Okay.
And this, everyone lost their minds. Well, not everyone. The northern bishops, rather. So there's three bishops up north of where the patriarch was. They're like, this is unfair. Like, the illusion of it being fair is gone. And so they wanted to have a rival patriarch against Shuman Isho. At that time, the residency of the patriarch was in a monastery called Rabin Hermes. Rabin Hermes is a monastery in Arkosh, and the abbot there, his name was John Solaka. Those three bishops from north who wanted a rival patriarch, they took the abbot, John Solaka, and they met in Mosul, and they had a lot of supporters in Mosul. The people drafted a letter, and they went to Rome. So the three bishops, John Sulaka, and the letter from the people, and Pope Julius III, he makes him Patriarch of Mosul in eastern Syria, or he also gives him the title Patriarch of the Eastern Assyrians and Patriarch of the Church of the Chaldeans of Mosul. Now, I think an inevitable question coming from you is like, why Chaldean? Why Assyrian? Where does it come
Mm.
from? And this becomes like the root of all the ethnic fighting between Chaldeans and Assyrians. The Roman Church actually uses Chaldean prior to this. So when the Council of Florence occurs, there's a there was an historian metropolitan in Cyrus, and he proclaims the faith of Catholicism, and they call him Chaldean. Why Chaldean? Well, in the European mind, one speculates that, well, you see, Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees, and from Ur of the Chaldees, that's let's say where Aramaic was the main language. And since Abraham is the father of the Hebrew language in the sense of that he was father of the Jewish people who use Hebrew, Aramaic is associated with Chaldean. So apparently that even in the European mindset, I don't know if it was from the Vatican, but they would identify Ethiopians who spoke Aramaic as, oh, they're speaking Chaldean. But funnily enough, a scholar, he's a priest, his name Father Andrew Yunan, a fantastic priest.
Yeah, I know of him. Yeah.
Yeah, he's hilarious on Twitter. Um,
He is.
he he makes the claim that the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages, the historians and scholars of the time would kind of interchangeably use Chaldean and Assyrian. So he translates one of the works, and from what I understand, is that those from the eastern side of, let's say, Mesopotamia. So he names the Aramaic speaking people east of the Euphrates as Chaldeans and Assyrians. So he uses them both. And I think that becomes influence in how the West identifies our church. But I digress. That's just maybe another discussion. If I'm more well formed, that's definitely one thing we can discuss. But Sulaka comes back. He is now patriarch of the Chaldeans. This is the Chaldean church now. But Shimon Isho, he doesn't take this well, because you have to consider that the patriarch was not only a ecclesiastical role, it was also a political role, because he represented the people. What he did, Shimon Isho, he snitched on Sulaka to the Ottomans. And what happened, he essentially tells them that, look, he's not the real patriarch, he's causing division, he's just come back from Rome, so you know that, Rome is not your friend. I'm the one that's how we say, I'm the one that's dependent of, like, I'm loyal to you guys. I wouldn't be telling you this if I'm lying. Sulaka's in prison and he dies. I'm sure they killed him, but they need a new patriarch. It continues. The new patriarch, his name is Abdisho Maroun. And so what ends up happening is now we have two lines in the Church of the East. The Nestorian line, I just use Nestorian as a misnomer, is known as the Elia line. The Elia line is because it's the nephew. All the successors take the Elia line. And the Chaldeans, they take Shimon. So they take Simon. I believe the reason they took Shimon or Simon is because not only maybe to, let's say, consider this is like the true successors, because before Elia became patriarch, that patriarch's name was Shimon. So I guess it's kind of saying, no, this is the real successors of Shimon. But others have suggested that it's a recognition of Rome's influence, that they get the authority from Simon Peter, that is from Rome. They saw them as valid. And even, like, I think we discussed this a while back. There was a letter from the 14th century of one of the patriarchs. He was very hyper papalist in his letter, where he identifies Rome as the Bishop of Rome as the true successor of Peter. Um,
And
and
this
so
was when they were still outside of communion.
yeah, this was still out. So they recognized Rome as a valid church either way. And that's why they went to them in the first place, because the bishops couldn't consecrate a new patriarch without Rome's help.
So what did Rome do to facilitate?
So
I
when
know
they
you've gone over it, but with all like the names for the first time, like when you haven't heard it before, it starts to get all jumbled up. So what was Rome's course of action?
they gave the patriarchate to John Sulaka. But as
Yeah.
soon as they appealed, it's like, I think they looked at it as, oh, this is the Nestorian church coming back. This is like the Chaldean, like what's his name? Was it Theodore? I said, from Cyprus.
Yeah.
He's Nestorian. He becomes Catholic. So this is the rest of them. They're coming back. All right, we give John Sulaka the patriarch of the Chaldeans.
So you're saying that like so when you just said Theodore of Cyrus, you mean like that?
Not Theodore.
No,
Sorry, let me
no,
get
no,
the
different. Yeah, okay.
Cyprus. Sorry, Theodore of
Cyprus,
Cyprus.
not Cyrus. Yeah, okay.
No, Cyrus. Yeah.
So at this point,
Hmm.
like what was the official moment of communion? Because it seems like there was just a closeness, a random closeness with Rome, so to speak. But when Rome consecrated this patriarch, is that when you identified now there is the Chaldean Catholic Church, or
Yeah.
was it like no, the Assyrian Church of the East became Catholic, then there was a patriarchal split that to resist that. Because like that's what happens with the Syriac Catholics. Like the Syriac Catholics as a whole elected a Catholic, a pro-union patriarch, and then another line rebelled against that. So it's almost as if the whole church became Catholic for like all of 2 minutes before most of it went back into schism. So it's like, is that kind of the trajectory here?
Well, to some extent, yeah, but not in the current state where. So at this point, 1552, when they go to Rome, this is where the Chaldean Church is first established.
Okay.
This is the first time that remnants of the Nestorian Church become in communion with Rome officially.
Yeah.
So those bishops from the north and all those supporters in Mosul, they are now under Rome's subjection. They are Chaldean Catholic, to say the least.
Yeah.
But as we mentioned, that the Shumon Isho, he snitches on Sulaka, he dies in prison. And so they went to Rome again to get the new patriarch for the Chaldeans, that being uh, Maroun. His name was Maroun. What and it continued, and the excuse me, there was a bishop, a patriarch, sorry, Shimon the ninth. His name was Dinkha as well. But this was only like less than 50 years after he reintroduced hereditary succession in the Chaldean church, and as a result, he just leaves Rome. So now we have two Nestorian lines again. Well, not again, but we have no more Chaldean Catholics. Let me rephrase that. There's no Chaldean patriarch anymore.
So the
So
Catholic
the
patriarch all of a sudden just split.
he splits. He
And
splits,
that was
and
because they
because
wanted to have a hereditary patriarch,
yeah,
patriarchal line.
he reintroduced it, and obviously Rome wouldn't allow it. Um, and I
A
think as well,
question on
it's
that: when you say hereditary, you mentioned one
mm,
pointed their nephew. They're not like it's not their sons, is it? It's not as if they were married priests who made patriarchs and then like they have kids. Or
no.
how does it work? I'm a bit
I
confused.
would assume that it will be like it's a nephew, so it's the one of their brothers or sisters' uh, children,
So,
and then they
so
just
so we're
appoint
still
them.
talking about like celibate bishops at this stage. It's not
Yeah,
like these
I
bishops had wives and were having kids.
yeah I wouldn't be surprised in some point in history that it did occur,
Yeah.
that they were still married, and that could be maybe the beginning of why hereditary succession occurred. But we can make it the assumption that they were celibate. It's usually the brothers and sisters' children that become the
Okay.
successors,
Yeah.
right? Because like, look, at the Middle Eastern family, they had like massive families, so there's at least a cousin and nephew there to designate.
So somebody within the just like as if it's a king, right? If it's not the son, it's going to be the brother's son, whatever it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
usually, but it's become for some. It's always identified that it was always uncle to nephew, uncle to nephew, uncle to nephew.
Yeah.
Um, so so now we have the Elia line, which is the original Nestorian. Then we have Shimon, which was Chaldean, but now they're no longer Catholic. But the bishops in Amid, so Amid was one of the, let's say, villages or that supported Sulaka to go to Rome and convert and to become patriarch.
Yeah.
So one of the bishops there, his name was Joseph or Joseph. They like there's no patriarch, and they were still supporters of Rome. Like they had no issue being Chaldean Catholic. So what he does, he decides to go to Rome and he claims for the title of patriarch himself. He doesn't bother talk to anyone else. He's like, I want the patriarch. Why not? And he gets it. And now we have three lines of Church of the East patriarchs. So we have Elia, the Nestorian line, Shimon line, which is the Chaldean first Chaldeans became Nestorian again, and now we have the Josephite line.
Yeah.
And they go in as usual. And it was not until the 1700s, so the Chaldeans they start growing in numbers. Rome sends out Dominicans to Mesopotamia to strengthen the Chaldean church. So,
I gotta say, I love the Dominican missionaries in
oh
Mesopotamia.
yeah, and they done a fantastic, and you will love
Much
the
better
story.
than the Jesuits in Lebanon, that's for sure.
There's
I'm
one way to
joking.
put it.
Did they burn as many documents?
Oh no,
No.
we're lucky. But the
Uh,
1700s is where Dominicans they work the magic, and so what happened? They didn't just stick with obviously the Chaldeans. They interacted with bishops from the Nestorian churches, and a bishop, his name was Yohanan. I think he was the nephew of the patriarch at that time, so 1780.
yeah.
He's been exposed to Dominicans, and he professes Catholicism whilst being Nestorian. He's like, I believe in Catholicism. And I think this is the reason why the hereditary practice stops. Because his uncle is like, I'm not going to designate you as patriarch if you're professing Catholicism, right? But yet, after he still manages to get a lot of the bishops to support him, and then when his uncle dies, he becomes patriarch. he gets elected by the bishops, despite the fact that he was pro-Rome, which is crazy to me. I'm not sure how he was able to get the bishops, because last time, like, just from briefly looking at history, the last time I saw that the patriarch was so eager to join Rome, all the bishops were like, "No, we don't want to do this." But all of a sudden, there's a new patriarch on the horizon, and he's so pro Rome. All of a sudden, they're like, "Yeah, this guy's all right." He appeals to Rome. So Josip appeals to Rome. He is the successor of the Elia line, so the original Nestorian line. He appeals to Rome. He's like, "I want to be patriarch of the Chaldeans," but he's
This
like,
is
"We
the
already have
most
a." I saw it. And he's like, "Well, we already have a patriarch for like the Chaldeans. That's the Josephites. But ask us why." And he makes it like, "Look, I have these supporters." Like he talks about his like I would say his support for him. It's like I'm the legitimate line of the Nestorian Church. I'm not sure his reasonings. I will have to look into that. But following the last death, the death of the last Josephite patriarch in Amid, it was in 1830. Yohanan, by the Vatican, is now the patriarch of the Chaldeans, and this is like that's the end of the history of the lines. The Chaldean Church today is therefore the Elia line, that is the original Nestorian line, and those who, let's say, oppose Patriarch Josip, they're like, we don't want to be Catholic. They inevitably were taken up by Shimon, and Shimon line is Assyrians today. And as we mentioned, Shimon is the line that initially became Chaldean, and they left to
Mm,
become Nestorian. So
that
it's
is
just ironic
so.
how we are
That
today.
is so. I did not expect that last flip. So that is
Yeah,
stuffed. Okay, that is
yeah,
very confused. So basically, there's an Nestorian line, a Catholic line. That Catholic line goes back to being Nestorian, and
yep,
then another Catholic line comes. Then that Catholic
yep,
line dies, and the original Nestorian line becomes
yep,
the Catholic line.
exactly. And the original Chaldeans are the Assyrians today, the Church of the
That
East today.
is
And then
that I've
history
never
repeats
heard of.
itself, and
Yeah, I was gonna say.
history repeats itself, and we're back now to three patriarch lines of the Chaldeans, of the Assyrians, and the ancient Church of the East. So, we never learn apparently from history.
I mean, I
And that's,
find that the theological flippancy that you keep describing is very indicative of a lot of the, a lot of like Middle Eastern
oh, yeah.
ways of thinking. It can be very, yeah. I just don't know. It's not as if they're like studying the rigorous history and coming to the conclusion after a thorough examination of the church
Mm.
fathers. It's like, you know what, Rome's got to give me the line. I'll take it.
Yeah, it took one bishop being so influenced by a Dominican to cause this. This
I
kills me
love
to
the
this day.
Dominicans.
Oh yeah, God bless them. Even my parents would talk about how much they love the Dominicans. I think there's a bishop they absolutely love. He's a bishop in Iraq, but he's actually Dominican, of the Chaldeans. And
Oh,
that bishop, apparently, when he was younger, there was a French Dominican, and when he was exposed to him, he gave him books, and he just read on whatever Dominicans were reading at that time, and he became a Dominican
go.
himself. And he's
So,
it's
so, um, how much do you still have in your notes? Because I've
well,
been saving up some questions, which I'm happy to leave till later. Um, but yeah, so I'm
yeah.
happy to like
So
run through the rest of the history, and then I can just go
well,
boom,
the
boom, boom
history.
with.
I think the history is good to we can settle here because let's say the more modern history where everything's a bit settled, it's just more it becomes very let's say political. Honestly, it becomes a WWE kind of story at this point, like as if
Yeah.
it wasn't already. But we can I can come to the conclusion that the Chaldeans today were the original Nestorians. The original Chaldeans became the Assyrians today,
Yeah.
and now we have another line of Assyrian patriarch, which is known the Ancient, and that only came around in the 60s. And these are the churches today, and we're a people of the diaspora. We have
Mm.
churches not only in Iraq, but we also have. I think we have an eparchy in Cairo, if I'm not mistaken. We have obviously in the USA, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We have in Republic of Georgia, UK. we're
Wow.
all over the
That's
place, you know.
that's a lot more than us, I think. I think we only have like two in
Actually,
America and a vicar for all of Europe and one in Australia and New Zealand and Australia, like all of the South Pacific.
yeah. If I'm not mistaken, I think we might have one in Sweden as well.
Wow. All right,
Yeah,
so I've got a question.
yeah, go for it.
Actually, before that, maybe if you know enough of the history, could you just
Yeah, I'll
touch
try.
on the split that happened in the Assyrian Church that brought about the ancient Church of the East? Because
Oh yeah.
just so people understand that, because there's, I think like more and more people, Western Christians are becoming more familiar with the various Eastern rites,
Mm,
and I think it's good to kind of like explain that. I mean, I think at this stage, unfortunately, the most famous and most well-known bishop from your tradition is in neither of these three communions,
oh
but
yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah, that's what.
just kind of
Mm.
give that split of what happened.
Well, in the this, I think there's two aspects. I think the first one was, I think it was another issue of um, hereditary consecration, if I'm not mistaken. But I know for a fact that the ancient Church of the East, the, there was the time in the Assyrian Church where they decided to move from the traditional Julian calendar to the Gregorian,
Yeah.
and at that one of the bishops was like, "No, we don't like that," and so as a result, the church, the ancient Church of the East, consecrated their own patriarch in 68, probably,
Yeah.
and this is pretty much so. You would differentiate the Church of the East, um, the the Assyrians as the new calendarist and the ancient as old calendarist.
Oh,
I'm sure there's
I
other
didn't know
political.
that was the reason. I did
Well,
not know
that's
that
one
was
of
the
the
reason.
reasons. I think there's other reasons. I may be conflating history. Maybe I'm just mixing them up. I
Mm,
think there was also an issue as well with consecrating the next bishop. I
yeah.
think, if I'm not mistaken, one thing that promulgated the split as well is, I think the patriarch, he designates a the new patriarch, and he was only like 12 years old. Yeah, he was very young. And
The
so
ancient
this, like,
East.
people lost it. So it's again a repeating of history. It's literally a repetition of history.
Yeah. Okay.
But this is the
So
churches today. Yeah.
all right. So, I mean, I find that sometimes with the East, we cause schisms first and then find theological reasons later. It's like I used to
Yeah,
never understand. Like, I used to think to myself, the division between schism and heresy is a bit blurry because, like, when do you ever have schisms without heresy involved? And then you just
mm,
study the early church and the Eastern and various Eastern churches, and you realize, like, no, that's the difference between schism and heresy.
yeah.
It's
Oh
always
yeah.
most schisms begin politically, and then I find
Mm.
that they're solidified through
In
heresy.
theology.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly, exactly. I,
Heresy
I, I
just solidifies the divide. It's oftentimes lots of splits don't begin along theological lines.
mm. Yeah, I agree with that most definitely. I remember like speaking to my father about it. Like when I was kind of, let's say, new into the theology realm, and he was just telling me, like, Milo, like, it's like a lot of it comes from political, like, gain, power, like whatever. And I took that as like, no, 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 no. These men are pious. It's everything's theology focused.
Yeah,
But the more, especially in our Middle Eastern
yeah.
temperaments, it makes sense, honestly. And the geographic reality at that time, what do you expect? You're gonna have that. It's gonna be promulgated by that and fueled by theology as a justification of those actions.
All right, so I've got a bunch of things I want to go through,
Go
um,
for it.
and they are a bunch. So it's up to you how long you want to drag this out. But I do
Yeah,
want to
we
get
can
through a few
discuss it.
stuff. So, firstly, I think I missed it when
Mm,
you talked about. So there's two things I think. So you kind of described very quickly the Church of the East. Speaking of, like, at Seleucia, Ctesiphon kind of establishes their own sense of prerogative.
mm.
We spoke about, and I just wanted to double check because I know you said it wasn't accepted, but was there ever explicit rejections? Like, is this something that even reached Antioch or
See, that's a
Alexandria or Constantinople or Rome, and they're like, hey, what the heck? No, we annul these canons,
yeah,
and
yeah. See, that's the thing. So when I said that, it wasn't, let's say, accepted. I'm not saying that there was an explicit rejection. I just don't
Yeah,
see anywhere so far from my research that Rome was aware. And in fact, majority of the history of the church is kind of like Rome doesn't know what's happening. Even during the
yeah.
Chaldean beginnings, they're like, what's happening? They don't really know. So,
Well, see, Rome knows what's appealed to them, which is quite a lot. But
mm,
again, like Persia's pretty far away.
yeah.
Like Alexandria is close compared to
Mm,
Persia, and Rome is also dealing with everything in Spain and Gaul and the Britons and every theological question that gets sent within its own patriarchate. So it doesn't like surprise me, but I just want to get the sense of the so really, like you wouldn't speak of a conscious rejection of communion until a deliberate acceptance of Nestorius.
yeah, just from like what I've read, it seems that the Church of the East is like formally condemned by Ephesus. Before that, it's
Okay.
just kind of like I don't.
Yeah. So
I'm not
you
sure if
wouldn't say
Rome was.
Seleucia Ctesiphon is a schism
No,
because I
no, no.
think
I
that's
wouldn't say that either. But I
okay.
would say it's the beginnings of the independency from the Western Church.
Because
But
you know I want to know this, right? Because I want to know how legitimately I can use Seleucia Ctesiphon against Eastern Orthodox. That's why.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
only reason I
Look,
care.
maybe God willing, when I have time,
Yeah.
I will go in. But just to give justice to the churches, I would love to make go into the ecclesial implications of those synods. If it's merely just like okay for the sake of politics, or there's like a deeper theological truth,
Yeah.
and as well the response. Because I didn't really see everywhere I read just purely I just for the audience to know, I read these like occurrence of synods isolated, so I wouldn't know, and I cannot make any would say a confident explanation or confident judgment of how Rome or other patriarchs reaction to these synods.
Yeah.
But that's on my end, yeah.
All right. And then the next thing I want to know is because there's a bit of a jump in the history, right? And then you say about, I
Mm.
think you said the 13th or 14th century. You, I missed what you said started the persecutions because obviously Islam was around in the 7th century.
Yeah,
So
we
what,
were, yeah.
so
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
was, yeah, so there's two questions here. What started in the second millennia that you brought up that caused all that persecution? Um, and then first to that is, um, did Islam have a significant effect? Because I've heard before that the Assyrian church's geographical border was the largest in the world at one time. Like
Mm.
of all the Christian denominations, not population wise, because it was very dispersed. And
Yeah.
obviously, that side of the world can have just large areas of nothing. But in
Mm.
terms of like geographical border, when people kind of trace out like the Assyrian church and its expansion into China and stuff, it's massive. Like
Mm. Yeah, it's
geographically,
massive.
it's
Yeah.
huge. I know because there's this sense these days that, and it's partially true because Islam killed it. The expansion done by the Eastern churches, and so Rome obviously always had the prerogative of expansion because Rome had within its jurisdiction and power the ability to establish other churches, and so Rome just kind of went westwards and just
Mm.
bam all of Europe, and then eventually America,
Yeah.
it's North and South America. But like it fascinates me. So yeah, it surprises me that Islam didn't do a significant damage. And then what was the thing that caused the damage later on?
I mean, Islam did cause some damage. So from discussing with family, this we actually teamed up with the Arabs to overtake the Persians. But then, as a result of that, we were made subject under the caliphate. So we were under the subjection. It was quite difficult to traverse, but there was still some respect. In fact, there's a beautiful dialogue from one of the patriarchs in the 700s, Mar Timothy the First, and his discussion with the caliphate, the king, and they're discussing between the theology of Islam and Christianity. And so I feel like, yeah, it did, let's say, hinder hinder the growth, and we were persecuted. But I think maybe the most, let's say, devastating one was from Timur Lane, from what I see. Timur
What is
Lane
that?
just so Timur Lane or Timur Lane, he was a conqueror from, I believe he was from like the Mongol Turk, uh, like he was Mongolian, and he absolutely wiped our people. He was killing us for sport, and it was so bad to the point where I believe a Syriac Orthodox, I think he was a religious, he was a missionary, he was exploring Mesopotamia, and he said that it was very quiet, it was very desolate because of the slaughtering that Tamerlane did to our people. And I think that was more of a significant impact than perhaps maybe Islam. Islam did suppress, we were persecuted, but Tamerlane himself and his conquering of the Assyrians within Mesopotamia, that was really that that was, let's say, the root of why the hereditary patriarch began, because they weren't able to come together. It was impractical, it was unsafe,
Yeah.
so they just like
And
keep it in the family, man.
how do you spell this man's name?
Uh, Tim, it's Timur, the lame. So he was Timur the lame, but sometimes they put it together as Timur Lane.
Oh, okay. And so we're
Yeah,
talking of that's all right. And I okay, and I had a suspicion that he would be all right.
yeah. Even the Syriac
I
Orthodox had issues with him. Like he also devastated a few of their people as
I
well. I
have
mean, we come
wow.
from the same roots, the Syriac Orthodox and the Assyrians, the Church of the East.
So he kind of descends from the Khans then.
Yeah.
Ah.
Well, yeah, I think so. I don't think he's the direct line from
No, not
Genghis Khan.
direct.
Like,
He's not claiming.
no,
He's claiming that he descends from a shared ancestor with Genghis Khan. I'm just
probably.
taking a look at it
But yeah,
now.
he absolutely devastated us. Yeah,
Wow. Okay.
yeah.
Um, so okay, that's really interesting. So with so then another question. You mentioned that calling the Assyrian Church of the East was a bit of a misnomer. Why is that? I mean, if they are fine with Nestorius and his theology, then what's wrong with calling them Nestorian? Not obviously, it's inappropriate to call you Chaldean Catholics Nestorian, though we do for fun. Um, why why is it inappropriate to call the Assyrian Church of the East Nestorian?
So the way you put it, that oh, they venerate Nestorius, they follow his Christology, they're Nestorian. Yeah, I guess we can say that. I say it's a misnomer because of the implications it has.
That it's bad.
It, yeah, that they're called Nestorian because they're heretics.
Yeah.
So I call it Nestor. So when I was saying Nestorian, it's for that reason personally. Like the Nestorian Church, this is how they were known. And I don't think most of them had an issue with being called Nestorian either. But it's usually more of I say misnomer purely from the lens of like they're not the heretics that they were painted to be. We never profess a two-person Christology. We didn't necessarily
Okay.
outright reject Theotokos. It's a it's completely nuanced. Like I've been
Okay,
reading
yeah,
the
no, no,
Hutha.
no. This,
Yeah,
this is what I was trying to get out. This is
yeah,
what I was trying to wonder is, it's just kind of like the way that the monophysites have tried to rebrand themselves as meophysites, but
mm,
I find that they're less apologetic about it than you guys
yeah.
try to be. Okay, that's interesting. So in other words, it's the you follow Nestorius, but you don't agree with the not you. Sorry, why am I talking to you
No, I
as
mean
if
the
you
Church of
do?
the East,
The
like
Church of the East follows Nestorius, but they don't like the connotations of what the rest of the church,
yeah, the West
all the
particularly. Yeah.
monophysites, the Chalcedonians,
Oh yeah.
ever viewed. Okay, interesting, interesting. So you guys
It's
basically, so the Assyrian Church of the East reckons only two ecumenical councils then.
well, I think there's a priest. His name is Kasha Ephraim, and he says that the Church of the East explicitly upholds Chalcedon. They, but definitely there's a lot of Chalcedonian language, and I think one of the church fathers in the Assyrian Church, his name is Madbabai or Madbawe. He wrote a book. It's considered his magnum opus called the Book of Union, and this is kind of like one would say the Christology of the Church of the East, and within it he upholds. I think he commends Chalcedonian Christology. Uh, so yeah, we reject Ephesus on the basis, oh well, not me, not as a Chaldean, not me, definitely not, but the Church of the East then. and now they would reject Ephesus on the basis of Nestoricist condemnation rather than the, let's say, uh, for refusal of using Theotokos, as usually the superficial historians or superficial understanding of Ephesus and the Church of the East was. Um, what was going to get at? So, yeah, so that pretty much for us, for the Church of the East, they're quite, let's say, very the pro two natures, to say the least. They're very diophysite, and they make it very clear in their writings.
Okay, so they're
Yeah,
diaphysites.
yeah,
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
It's very clear in the way they write and what they explicitly say, as well the Christology. It's just if you go to a Chaldean priest, my Chaldean priest would say, "Oh, he's two kiana, one parsopa," which means two natures, one person, which is like Chalcedonian.
yeah.
But the
Well,
contention, the contention was the usage of the Syriac word gnoma. Gnoma is, let's say, equivalent to hypostasis if we were to translate it directly. But the
so when
problem is, yeah, go ahead.
then you say, and so if it sounds like you're saying two hypostasis, then people are going to
Yeah,
think two persons.
and that's the problem because the Syriac and Ephraim makes this clear in his works. Gnoma refers to the concrete existence of Kiana. So Kiana is nature, but it's an abstract concept.
Yeah,
Gnoma is the concrete existence, so like the manifestation of it. Um, uh, there was a good example of this. Like you have two phones, they share one Kiana. It's one nature. It's a phone, but there's two Gnoma because the two examples of that nature. And so, as such, in the person of Jesus Christ, maybe a better way to translate the Syriac words is there's two natures in which there are two substances in the one person of Jesus Christ. And this is what the East Syriacs and the Church of the East have professed since the beginning. It's so much so that, you know, there's always contention. Like the Alexandrians and the Church of the East had a history of contention. You know,
well,
they.
yeah,
I think Cyril is actually accursed in one of the liturgical texts, if I'm not mistaken, in the Church of the East.
yeah. Okay, yeah, interesting. So, okay, that's interesting. Well, that explains why the Alexandrians are so opposed to well, not so explains, but that just feeds into the tradition kind of divide between the Alexandrians and the way they view us as uh, they view Chalcedonians as Nestorian. All right. So that kind of contextualizes the Christology of that side of the question because I've always focused on more like Chalcedon's debate and
Hmm.
never really the lingering attitudes of the churches in the East. All right, so what do I have left that I want to cover? Theological. So, so then, when it came to dealing with theology
Hmm.
in unification, was dealing with the theology a major thing? Like these churches seem to just become Catholic out of nowhere. Was there a reason that, like, was there a discernment of the theology, or was it just because obviously
Um.
with other churches there's heavy theological discussions that
Hmm.
often precede this.
Yeah. So I think that's where the Dominicans did their work. Um. Yeah. This is where they helped with the formation of the Chaldeans today because they became Chaldean, but they weren't really anti-Nestorian to say the least. Like they weren't really uh, they're still attached to the roots, obviously. So it took the Dominicans to kind of like educate them, form them, and then by the time eventually it became assimilated in the Chaldean culture. Um, but during the times of the Uniates, it was purely political. So like,
Mm.
I want to be patriarch, sack this patriarch, let's go to Rome. It wasn't. It wasn't really about Christology. It wasn't about theology. It was the efforts of the Dominicans helped, let's say, clarify and Catholicize the Church of the East members who are now Uniats.
Okay. All right. And then what about as a last, well, yeah, kind of, oh, not last, second last, Latinization.
Mm,
How was the Western approach? And I don't want to use Latinization as a
the
terrible
bad thing.
insult on the West, like some people like to do. I mean, the history of our churches often saw voluntary Latinization. So I kind of want to get a sense of um, how, to what extent did the Chaldean Catholics change things on account of their union? So, do
Oh,
you guys
yes.
look exactly like the Syrian Church of the East
No,
liturgically
far from.
today?
I would say, I'll take that back. I would say far from it. You will see the essence of our liturgies, but there is Latinization, as you would say. And most of it did come, let's say, in more of like post Vatican II. I think you and I can agree that, especially post Vatican II, there seems to be a tendency of the Eastern churches to try to follow let's say, the approaches of Rome with no kind of like justification why. Like they shouldn't, like we shouldn't all look Latin, but there was this tendency of the East, not all Eastern churches, to try to follow suit. And as such, you get to see that, like, I go to a Maronite liturgy, you go to a Chaldean liturgy, there's elements of, let's say, the new mass or what's expected of the new mass embedded in there. And as such, currently, the veil, the ad orientem, is no longer present, and the high altar is no longer present, or very rare you would find it in Chaldean churches.
But so that those Latinizations sound to me like post Vatican II Latinizations. They're
Yeah,
not,
most different.
not. Oh, okay. So,
Yeah,
because
they came
I
from
guess
after.
more thinking along kind of what happened with the Maronites, where we changed a lot before Vatican II, and Vatican II became an odd turning point for us because in some ways we became more traditional, going back to
Mm,
Eastern practices, and in other ways we became less traditional, adopting some of the new Roman changes. So you're telling
mm.
me that up until Vatican II, Chaldean Church was basically untouched liturgically?
There were some, let's say, reform, even like from the before the unions, there was some reform because of the persecution that were going on. So the architecture used to be radically different. It used to very it used to imitate kind of a synagogue or the temple of Jerusalem in a sense. There was a bema, and then there was like a, let's say, a hall that goes towards a sanctuary with a veil. But that kind of like was centralized into an entire sanctuary where the bema is, and the veil was still there, and that is continued to this day. And the Chaldeans specifically, from what I understand, it's more, let's say, the liturgical aspects of the prayer. So the one thing I think that was changed definitely is, let's say, the in the both in the liturgy of the hours and in the actual liturgy, that the recognition of, let's say, the Greek doctors, so Nestorius and all that, they're no longer mentioned. That Mother of God is emphasized,
Yeah,
like I, no joke. The
understandably.
Yeah, of course. And I think one aspect as well, definitely, is the introduction of the institution narrative in Anaphora of Ad Mari. I'm not sure
Oh
when
yeah,
it
that
was
one.
introduced.
Yeah,
Maybe when the Chaldeans. I'm not entirely sure because even uh, Daniel Karkish from Lionsden, he was doing a discussion with Father Peter from Arizona. He's a Chaldean priest, and he
yeah.
makes a claim. The Syriac Orthodox also have Anaphora of Ad Mari, but they have the institution narrative. So it could have existed prior to the union.
Oh, really? But
Yeah.
then
So I
that's
was
so
surprised.
bizarre
Yeah.
because like Rome came out to actually defend the liturgy of the Mari and say that it's valid even without the institution narrative, which is
Yeah.
so there
It's
could
very weird.
still
Yeah.
be a legitimate argument that the originally it did possess the institution narrative, but Rome went ahead and still said that it's legitimate without.
Well, I think in the original Anaphora, I think we're safe to say that it did not include the institution narrative. I'm not
Okay.
sure which, I don't know under what compulsion of the Syriac Orthodox. Maybe someone who's watching this who's Syriac Orthodox, they can clarify it. Um, but it's adding to Rome. Yeah, it's funny because Rome, they encourage that if there's Chaldeans and Assyrian liturgy, that they should introduce the words of institution. The they're kindly invited to to add the institution.
Hmm.
But I think the majority of the reforms is very clear in 2014. 2014 was a very, let's say, not a fun time for Chaldeans in the Reformation sense of the liturgy. The it wasn't responded well, especially from the priests from San Diego. A lot of the things were just removed without any a proper justification, and one
Who
of it,
did
which
these
sucks,
reforms?
there was a synod
Yeah.
led by the patriarch at the time. I think I think he's the current patriarch now. Sorry, uh, they had a reform in 2006, but they went and reformed it again for some reason. I'm not sure what was the motivation behind it.
Hmm.
And they took there's no emphasis on veils or the curtains. There's no emphasis on ad orientem, and they they chopped up a few parts of the liturgy. So, for example, in the beginning and ending of the liturgy, traditionally we would have the recitation of the Our Father with the Sanctus. So we will say,
Hmm.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And the brilliance of this was that right after we say, hallowed be thy name, we say, holy, holy, you are holy. Heaven and earth cry out to you, all angels and men say, holy, holy, you are holy. And then we
Wow.
recite the Our Father. And that is repeated in the beginning and the end. And obviously the Our Father is said before communion. But that was, the beginning and end was chopped away. There was no reason for it to be removed. Um, but if you want, I have like a little document here that kind of like briefly explains the first, second, like in centuries, the way the liturgy was formed. If you're interested,
Yeah, I'd be interested if you send that. I
okay,
could put
I'll
that in the
just
description.
yeah, add that to the description.
And
One
then
thing, actually, one thing I want to, the one thing I noticed, we used to have as well four readings in the liturgy.
yeah. Wow.
We used to have a Book of Moses, Prophet, Epistle of Paul, and then the Gospel. Uh, that's no longer. I don't think even in the Assyrian Church they would do three readings
Wow. Well, that's
conventionally,
odd
but there
because
used
we
to be four.
recently
Yeah.
just went from two to three. We brought back our third, and then
You brought back to three.
recently. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the last question, because I do have to
Mm.
duck off,
Yes.
but I
Yes.
just wanted to give a couple of minutes to just talk about this, was a lot of Chaldeans and Assyrian Christians have been displaced from
Mm.
Iraq. So I just wanted you to chat a little bit about um, what is left of the church in its original homeland.
Oh, I think. Look, see, I was born and raised in Australia, so I can't say that. I'm not. Let's say entirely aware of the situation in Iraq, but I know there is still a thriving community back home.
Hmm.
You know, it's not as, let's say, difficult as it was maybe within the last decade or so, especially with ISIS and what have you.
Yeah.
Um, it's in Iraq. It's the patriarchate is there. It's in Baghdad, and there's many churches there. Most of them from the villages, and a lot of them from the city where my parents grew up. They're still there. They're still thriving, and so it's a good community there.
Hmm.
But I'll say the vast majority of us are overseas in the diaspora, and the fruits of Chaldean Catholicism is very, I would say, more advertised. I would say, or more clear in the Western countries.
Yeah.
And I'd say it's a blessing that, like, the fact that our tradition, which was first centralized in Persia, extended from Cyprus to Egypt, no, sorry, Cyprus to China, but then went back to Mesopotamia, is now all over the world. I think our ancestors, despite the persecution we went through, it's in itself a blessing. But that's all I can say in Iraq because I I wasn't born there. I'm not too
Hmm.
informed on the community there. My parents would know definitely, but
Well, thank God for the expansion at least.
yeah, glory to
Um,
God.
yeah. All right. Thank you very much, Milo. That was really informative for me at least, and I hope it's informative to everybody else who listens to this. Um, I mean, God bless. Is there anything you wanted to say before we end this?
Um, I would say the only thing I would say maybe for those who are interested in Chaldean Catholicism, uh, you're more than welcome to attend. I highly encourage you guys to go and say, like, I'm going to go to Chaldean liturgy, because our liturgy extends, like, there is such a Semitic origin to it, where the Mesopotamian way of prayer is very akin to that of the synagogues. And as such, one of the what's his name? Saha Jamal, who's one of the bishops from America. He makes the claim that it's probably our anaphora and our liturgical life is the closest and genuine cultural continuity from apostolic tradition because of the Semitic aspect. And so, as such, when you experience it, you are going to be stepping into a very ancient people and ancient practice, and it's a very beautiful experience. So, highly encourage. Um, and as well, one more thing, just like when it comes with Church of the East history, be very careful of the inflammatory stuff. Like, and by that I mean we're not the heretics, or we were not the heretics as we were painted to be. Do the research and make a judgment out of yourself. That's what I would say, just out of sake of charity.
Fair enough. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. God bless
Yeah. Thank
everybody.
you.